Welcome everyone. We're delighted you're able to join us for Net Zero is Not Enough, the final event in our Achieving Net Zero programme. I'm Sophie Nellis, Research and Projects Officer at Future of London. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're an independent network supporting those working in planning, housing, regeneration and economic development. Thanks to our fantastic sponsors, Arup, Lancet, Montague Evans and Pollard Thomas Edwards. In 2020, Future of London has been bringing you a series of events on achieving net zero. We've looked at net zero housing, we've looked at district heating schemes, behaviour change, the green recovery, and importantly, how we're going to pay for it all. We've also written a number of case studies showcasing inspiring examples of best practice, from low-cost interventions to large-scale infrastructure. And all the work we've done so far can be found on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And I think you should be able to find links to both of these in the chat in just a couple of moments. So our programme has highlighted the need for new policies, new initiatives and strong cross-sector relationships. But it's increasingly clear, partly due to the pandemic, that we can't separate net zero from social justice issues and also health and well-being. So as part of London Climate Action Week, today we're discussing the language of climate action and inaction and the critical role that regenerative solutions should play in moving us beyond a net zero ambition. And we'll also learn how the built environment sector can incorporate issues of social justice and new ways of thinking about health and well-being into its climate change strategies and net zero ambitions. Please join us on social media using our handle @FutureOfLDN, or if you're on LinkedIn, Future of London, using the hashtags NetZeroLDN and LCAW 2020. That's for London Climate Action Week. So to discuss what more we should and could be doing to mitigate the impacts of climate change, we're joined today by 5 brilliant speakers from across the UK. So it's my pleasure to welcome Ben Smith, Tom Dollard, Kristin Geider, Dr. Helen Pinio and Zarina Ahmad. Each speaker will shortly share their view on thinking beyond net zero, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion and then an audience Q&A. We want you to debate, challenge, question and think about the ideas being discussed today. So please get involved using the chat and the Q&A function and also on social media, as I just mentioned. So to ask our panelists a question, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and remember to tell us who you are and which organisation you work for so that we can credit you when we read these out. We'll try to get through as many as we can. And use the chat function to share your own ideas, insight and learnings. So to start us off today, we're joined by Ben Smith. Ben is Director of Integrated City Planning at Arup and a volunteer founding trustee of the National Park City Foundation. If and when we reach net zero, there will be some residual emissions. And Ben's going to talk us through how we might offset these and also explain why we need to better understand the importance of nature in the delivery of net zero and beyond. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. So look, I know the theme for the event this morning is that net zero is not enough. But before going there, I thought it would be useful just to remind ourselves about what the target means. It means all territorial emissions, that's emissions produced within the UK boundaries, reduced to net zero by 2050. And to do that, and do forgive me if you've been busy reading Boris's 10-point plan this morning, we'll need to do a lot of things. We'll need to reduce electricity emissions to close to zero, increasing deployment of renewables and possibly nuclear power. We have to decarbonise backup power generation. And remember, that's in the context of probably an overall increase in electricity demand as more ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, and electric cars come on stream. We need to almost completely decarbonise heat from buildings, which is a massive retrofit challenge for the UK, and we'll have to deal with residual gas demands in buildings, either with hydrogen or biomethane. HGV lorries will need to transition away from fossil fuels. It will be similar in the rail sector, and we'll see strong policy to curb private car use, promote active travel, and allow no future growth in air travel. Industry, agricultural, and waste sectors will also need to rapidly decarbonise. And amongst all of that, there's lots of unresolved issues, questions around investment to support the supporting infrastructure, planning hurdles, uncertainty around who pays, concerns around some of the technologies and so on. So look, net zero might not be enough, and I'm going to go on to talk about that, but let's be clear that it will be a real challenge. The next slide, please. But the target is net, right? So what that means is that we don't have to eliminate all emissions to zero. We can make some use of offsets and to offset the emissions that we can't eliminate. And whenever I've seen a trajectory model to zero carbon, whether that's at national level for a city or for a corporate, nobody ever gets to zero through their own actions. They get as far as they can, and there's a gap, and they have to offset those emissions, what we refer to as the residual emissions, as Sophie said. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. So one way is through carbon capture and storage, and a second way is through eco-sequestration, which is, to you and me, it's tree planting or it's natural land regeneration, so it could include peatland restoration. And you may have seen in the news, the government has committed to around 30,000 hectares of new woodland annually until 2050. And the assumption is that 1/5 of current agricultural land will be needed to be converted to these alternative uses, which includes afforestation, but could also be energy crops as well. So next slide, please. So I think it's pretty clear already that offsetting is going to be an important part of the net zero conversation. Everybody is going to need to be looking to offset their residual emissions. And guess what? This is already pretty difficult. The offsets are pretty hard to come by. So if you called up the gold standard looking to buy carbon offsets, equivalent to say the pre-COVID emissions or from flights for a company like the one I work for, Arup, it may well be the case that they don't have enough, and if they do have enough, then those offsets might not be within the UK. So if you then decide to take matters into your own hands and try and secure your offsets locally, you probably need to find a landowner, a broker, maybe a forest manager. You might have to learn how the Woodland Carbon Code works. Maybe pretty much start from scratch. And it's worth saying as well that the landowners may not be that interested because the incentives that they've been promised are not there yet. So I think it's important to say for those of us working in the built environment sector, where we tend to focus more on the design and the specifications of the project that we're delivering in urban areas, that it's probably not okay just to assume that the offsets will be there when we need them. We know that a mature UK-based carbon offset market will be required to get us to net zero, and we probably have to be thinking now about how we help to catalyse that market and do so in a way which delivers the ecological, community and economic benefits that we want beyond just the carbon sequestration. So if you could move me on another slide, please. And here's the real shocker, is that everything I've talked about so far in relation to net zero is relating only to our territorial or in-boundary emissions. We consume 70% more than our territorial emissions. So that's meaning emissions that we import into the country through our global supply chains. In general terms, per capita emissions track with wealth levels. So in rich countries like ours, our consumption emissions far outstrips what we emit within our boundaries. A lot of the food we eat, the clothes we wear, and probably the devices that you're all watching me on now have supply chains which stretch way, way outside of the UK. And it is true, and I'm sure many of you know already, that in some cases, that demand for stuff is still driving a destruction of nature. Global Forest Watch found that 12 million hectares of tropical forest was destroyed in 2018. So look, I know this is a really, really simplistic picture, far more simplistic than it is in reality. But what I would say is it's not enough, in my opinion, to be driving towards net zero here, desperately trying to get more trees into the ground in the UK. If, on the other hand, our demand for stuff importing from overseas is still driving nature destruction elsewhere. Next slide, please. So I had the great privilege a couple of years ago of listening to Harrison Ford make an impassioned speech on just this issue. And what he said was, while you work to meet the challenge of climate change, I beg of you, don't forget nature. And look, I know he's a movie star and not a scientist, but in this issue, I think he's actually quite right. Pre-COVID, Natural England study showed that 1 in 7 children in London had not been taken to a park by their parent or guardian in the last year. And we know that nature connection is important in encouraging pro-environmental behaviour. As I've already said, our consumption emissions are 70% higher than our territorial emissions. And I don't think we're having enough of a conversation about what sort of damage that's doing to the natural environment globally. IUCN has a red list of threatened species, which includes over 100,000 species. And of these, a quarter of those are already threatened with extinction. So I don't think that we should forget nature in the narrative around net zero. But look, to finish where I started with a bit of balance, I think we can say, understanding the science of climate change, that net zero for the UK is not enough, given what we know. But it is still a world-leading ambition, and it's something that we should be working together to try and achieve. It's just that as we do that, we should keep in mind these other narratives around nature and consumption. So that's all for me this morning. Thanks a lot, Sophie.
Thank you, Ben. That was great. Yeah, some really important points there, and interesting to tie in those different narratives and encourage all of us to bear them in mind as we're thinking about net zero. So we're now joined by Tom Dollard, Associate Partner and Head of Sustainable Design at Pollard Thomas Edwards. Tom is going to discuss the language of net zero and explain the role and benefits of regenerative design.
Hello, everybody. Just need to get my video going. Ollie, can you do my video? Okay, that's fine. I'm going to start by talking about what architects can do. So we've got essentially three things, I think, 3 points that architects and the roles of developers in an urban environment, what we can deliver. So essentially we have, next slide please. Essentially the biggest problem we have for new build housing buildings is this policy of what is net zero for new buildings. It's very lots of different definitions, essentially very difficult to define. There we go. There's my video. Right. So this is the definition. This is the UK Green Building Council and the LETI guidance for new buildings. So go and have a look at that. I'm not going to talk about that today, but what I will respond to is this enough, and how can we go further? So essentially, this is a challenge. So next slide. And I think the hardest thing about this idea of getting net zero in new buildings is going to be showing it and proving it. And at the moment, there's just not enough data. So we really don't know how our buildings are performing. There's very little metered data available. There's a handful of case studies that have monitored data available, and we just don't know where we are in terms of carbon emissions for the new build. So these are 3 images from some of our projects that show that response, how to monitor some renewable energy, and then doing the social side as well. Next slide, please. And then I think going beyond that, so the first stage is to measure how we are, what we're doing now. The second stage is to go way beyond net zero and start looking at energy positive. And really how can we do that? So this is a case study, and there's lots of case studies from the Building for 2050 project that we're working on with a number of partners that are looking at energy positive buildings, so being net providers. So that's one way you can do it. You can go way beyond. But even then, is that really enough? You've still got a lot of stuff there. You've got a lot of carbon in the construction side, and we know that the construction carbon is a large part of what we need to do in the next 10 years. The next 10 years are really critical for climate change. So is this an appropriate response? Possibly not. Even this is good enough. So next slide, please. This next case study is really something that we need to be looking at far more seriously. This is building using waste material. This is the Brighton Waste House by BBM. There's lots of other case studies coming up now. There's a real movement of building using recyclable material, using waste as a building material, essentially, which is the key benefit of regenerative architecture. You're essentially closing that loop of waste and creating a new or refurbished property and homes in this case. So I think you can see that there's a number of ways you can be regenerative, going from what Ben was talking about in terms of nature and rewilding and offsetting, which arguably we'll probably discuss the validity of offsetting, because arguably you should be doing it anyway. So is it is it complementary? Is it adding anything? But I'd certainly agree that you need to do as much as you can on every site, and really try and limit the carbon that you are building with, because that's the upfront carbon, as much as possible, and look at the wider benefits of doing that. So in this case, there's all sorts of wider benefits. And then the last slide, just like to summarize really. So I've shown you kind of 3 ways that we can go beyond this idea of net zero. So first of all, we need to make sure it's builds as possible. So this case study is where I'm at now. This is my home office. So I've got a little electric meter here, and then you can see in my video, I've got it's all made out of timber. So it's reclaimed timber from various construction sites around London. So I'm really trying to limit the initial carbon that I'm using to build this home office, essentially down to just transport emissions. And then I'm rewilding the back end of my garden with the green roof. So kind of big tick there for biodiversity and a positive giving back something to the site. And I'm really trying to then reduce any carbon, any material, any resource, any new resource by using recycled windows, doors, railway sleepers with the foundations, timber cassettes. We had insulation in the reused insulation in the roof and the walls. And you can see all around me on the top here is all scaffolding poles for the structure. And it's really saying you don't have to have a brand new shiny building. You can go, and we will need to go this radical to go beyond. We will need to recycle everything. We'll have whole factories of recycling reclaimed goods around London, around the UK, and reclamation yards will be used to recycle old buildings. So I guess I'll finish there, but I think my question is, how recyclable are the buildings that we're doing now? Even the PVs, the renewable technologies. What are we going to do once that's all finished? And in 20 years' time, you've got thousands of photovoltaic panels on our roofs, or cladding, or whatever. How are we going to recycle that? How are we going to make new in 2050? Thank you very much. I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. That was great. Really nice to have a live case study, as it were. Yeah, hear how some of these things have worked literally in practice for you. So I'd now like to invite Kristin Geider, manager of the London Climate Change Partnership, to share her insight into how the climate is already changing and affecting the UK. So Kristin, if you can have your video and audio on. Yeah, brilliant. Over to you.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks very much for including me in this discussion. So yeah, I really liked the title of this event, Net Zero is Not Enough, because as someone who works on climate change adaptation, I think it's sort of zero carbon is not enough is something we've been saying for quite a long time. But effectively, I think just no kind of siloed thinking is ever enough. We need to think a little bit more broadly, and I'll say a little bit about the need to think across sectors and priorities so that we can make sure that our urban environments work for everybody in a changed climate. So next slide, please. Right, so this, back to basics, this kind of ugly graph shows UK temperatures over this century, given the best and worst case emission scenarios. And the thing you want to notice here is that the graphs are pretty much identical well into the middle of the century. And so the point here is basically that even if all global emissions stop tomorrow, warming continues for a few decades. And just to be really clear, I mean, emissions reduction efforts are absolutely crucial now, and definitely now, to avoid catastrophic change later in the century. But we do need to be prepared for what's coming in the meantime. Next slide, please. And in the meantime is actually already happening. So we're already seeing the effects of climate change. We've had devastating fires in the Arctic, in the Western United States, and South American wetlands over the past few months. Last week, 2020 officially, I think, became the most active hurricane season on record, with 29 named storms, and I think that's actually up to like 30 or 31 at this point. And here in the UK, we've seen events like the deadly rail crash in Stonehaven in Scotland due to water undermining the stability of the embankment. We've seen floods in Croydon, we've seen record heat waves, we've seen heathland fires in Surrey, and I think it's important to note that even those disruptive events that happen outside of London have knock-on effects for London. So we do need to be thinking about how we're talking, not just within our own little circles. Next slide, please. So in London, we've been able to quantify and kind of visualize how climate change plays out in a practical way. And so here you can see, our exposure to surface water flooding in terms of the numbers of properties affected. You can see the water supply demand deficit for London, which starts to get pretty serious around the 2040s. And you see some thermal imaging of, high temperatures in an apartment building. That's due to exposure to the sun. And that's basically just to say that, how we understand the risks and how we adapt to climate change is not just about what falls out of the sky or the temperatures outside. All of that gets moderated or exacerbated by the built environment and by other factors as well. Next slide, please. And those other factors include things like inequality and injustice. So climate risk is also about the conditions that drive vulnerability and make people more at risk in the first place, or affect people's ability to prepare for, respond to, or recover from disruptive events, whether from climate or anything else. And a few of those conditions are listed here. And it's not going to be surprising to anybody that they're largely about poverty and deprivation. So those with the most resources will be the most resilient, the most able to adapt, while those without will be further disadvantaged, when shocks come, when things like weather events or floods or storms or whatever. And I would just note the parallels here with what makes people or puts people at higher risk of COVID-19, this current pandemic. We've definitely seen that, some of the things that make people particularly vulnerable to heat waves, for example. So I think I would just urge people, to use that and think about the potential benefits of cross-disciplinary working. Just to say, the picture on the right is of some brand new vulnerability mapping we've done in London that just shows parts of London with high exposure to climate impacts and with high concentrations of vulnerable people, according to those kinds of metrics. And we're starting to roll this out, and we've already started to think about how to use it in decision making. So for example, where to give grants under the Mayor's Grow Back Greener Fund, for example. It's really just about understanding how to target our programs and our projects to support people who need it the most, or at least, not to disadvantage people further. Next slide, please. And I think this is something we also need to think about with regard to our solutions and not just the risks, whether we're thinking about retrofit or we're thinking about greening. The interventions that we make to try to improve sustainability can actually end up reinforcing or exacerbating inequality if we don't specifically consider inequality and disadvantage when we're developing those solutions and those interventions. So this example shown of energy efficiency retrofit and the problems that can sometimes occur for comfort, indoor air quality, and overheating. And I think in some cases, we fail to think about or talk to the people who are on the receiving end of the benefits that we think we're trying to implement. And we end up finding out that the things we're doing aren't actually seen as beneficial to those people. And I'm thinking in my own area here of the low traffic neighborhoods where, there's been a lot of pushback from local people. So I think we need to get out of this mindset of kind of, we're just doing something really good and we'll make people understand later, and really bring people into the conversation about what we're trying to do. So that's just to say, well, we have, excellent, ambitious opportunities to create more resilient, more energy efficient, healthy, sustainable conditions. That doesn't really happen automatically just because I'm doing my good thing over here. We actually have to have intention to get out of our silos and talk to one another. And I think that's where I will leave it. And I think there's one more slide. And yeah, that's me, if anyone wants to get in touch. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Kristen. That was brilliant. And yes, sort of breaking down silos and cross-sector working is, very close to our hearts at Future of London. So I think that was a really important point to stress. And I think some of the points you've raised, both Helen and Zarina are also going to touch on in their presentations. So we're now going to hear from Dr. Helen Pinio. Helen is a lecturer in healthy and sustainable built environments at UCL. She's going to explain the concept of planetary health and how we can move towards healthy urbanism. So thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Sophie. My name is Helen, and I'm an urban planner, and I went into academia just a couple of years ago. Before that, I was working in urban planning and sustainable design and construction in the UK and internationally. Next slide, please. I'd like to highlight what has already been discussed a little bit about the connections between health and natural systems, and also the resilience or lack of resilience that some communities have in relation to shocks that may come from the impacts of climate change. But actually, COVID has been a very clear reminder to us that because of social injustice and environmental injustice, some communities are really adversely and disproportionately affected by shocks. And COVID was one of those, where we saw that low income and minority ethnic groups were disproportionately affected. And the same is happening with climate change. And planetary health is a way of talking about how human health and the health of the planet are interrelated. And I've put a definition here which says the concept of planetary health is based on the understanding that human health and human civilization depend on flourishing natural systems and the wise stewardship of those natural systems. And I think in relation to urban planning and other built environment professions, over the last 10 years or so, there has been a real increase in discussions about how we can promote health. But oftentimes it's separated from sustainability discussions, and you would see in policy documents that health might focus on food environment and also physical activity, and talking about the co-benefits for sustainability, but not always linking together how essentially connected these areas are. Next slide, please. So I've developed a new conceptual framework about what it means to have healthy urbanism. How can we as built environment professionals working in cities make decisions at a building level or for neighborhood scale development and policy, all the way up to working with our city region partners? How can we make decisions that will support health? And it's not just about, of course, access to health services, and it's not only about food and physical activity, but it starts with planetary health. And so I've put that at the center of this diagram, where through enhancing biodiversity and promoting resource efficiency, like the circular economy ideas that Tom was discussing, and zero carbon, we will have an impact on planetary health. The health of people around the world will be affected. This diagram is multi-scalar, so we're looking at different spatial scales, how decisions that we make in London can affect the health of anybody around the world through the mechanisms of environmental breakdown, but also temporal scales. So some decisions we make could impact people moving into a new house or a new office space in a year's time, but other decisions may take 10 or more years for the impacts to be felt. So going back to those scales, planetary health at the center. If we don't have planetary health, we haven't got anywhere safe to live. So I've put that very purposefully, intentionally at the beginning, at the center. And then ecosystem health, where it's a little bit closer in terms of the impacts for our air and our water and soil quality. We depend on those, again, to survive. And then finally moving out to local health on the outer scale, where those are our more immediate environments, the buildings and the neighborhoods that we live and work in. And the cross-cutting principles to the Thrives framework are sustainability, equity, and inclusion. And this is recognizing that, particularly in relation to equity and inclusion, are areas that many built environment professionals haven't learned a lot about how to address these. But they're all three interrelated. So bringing health with these three core principles is the way that I'm defining healthy urbanism through the Thrives framework. Next slide, please. I've kind of already discussed these key messages. So we need to think beyond the boundaries of development in projects, think about how the impacts will affect distant locations, but also over time. Because of the structural barriers that prevent healthy living for many people, we need to target interventions and design with inclusive processes. And we need to recognize that environmental degradation affects health now, and we can use sustainable design principles in an integrated way to think about how to best create sustainable housing and new development. Next slide. I just have two very brief slides of case studies, and one is the Bullitt Center. And there's a lot of information you can find online, existing case studies about the Bullitt Center in Seattle. But I think it's a fantastic example where they tried to push the boundaries on technologies for net zero energy and carbon and water. So they're doing everything they can on site. And I think that building on Tom's point, this has been heavily evaluated, and that evidence is so crucial for us to build a strong business case to do this again. One evaluation showed that there were $18.45 million in public benefits from all of the infrastructure that this building provides for itself. Next slide, please. Another example is the Nightingale 1 development in Australia. And here they have very strong NATHERS rating, which is a sustainability energy rating system in Australia, 100% fossil fuel free, and it should say free, and passive design that is thinking about the occupant's health. So they're using sustainable design principles to keep the running costs low and to provide also that laundry facility that you see on the roof. That's for efficiency of water and energy, but it also is a social opportunity and gives people more space in their homes. So those are just a couple of brief examples, and the next slide is a closing slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. That was really interesting. Really interesting case studies that you shared with us. And I'm seeing lots of comments in the chat, which is great. I'm really glad that people are engaging and sharing their ideas there. And yeah, complimenting you on your framework. So it was very well explained. Thanks a lot. So our final speaker today is Zarina Ahmad, Climate Change and Environment Specialist at Semvo, Scotland. She's going to talk to us about climate justice within the built environment sector and how we can make sure that no communities are left behind as we move towards and beyond net zero. So over to you, Zarina.
Hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me along today. So I work for a race equality organisation called Semvo Scotland, and my work has predominantly been to engage BME communities, so that's Black and minority ethnic groups, within the climate change arena. So why now? That's a question that I would like to pose. It's like, well, why are we considering who is coming to the table? And for me, I think the Black Lives Matter movement has actually highlighted the existence of inequalities globally and locally. It also has highlighted who holds power, who holds privilege, and this has played a huge role in creating these inequalities and perpetuating them. So we need to recognise that. Why are we looking for change now? And again, looking at climate justice, so it's issues such as land use, food production, energy efficient, and all of these lead to questions of social justice, i.e. who has access to land, who has food security, and who has energy access. And this isn't a global question. For me, this is very much a local question. So underpinning all of these injustices are racism, capitalism, colonialism. So looking at environmental justice, climate justice, and other structural equalities, because they are so multifaceted issues, we need to consider what can we do. Next slide, please. So I suppose we're here really to look at inclusive cities. In order to strengthen social cohesion in cities that are striving to be ethical and sustainable, recognising if those that are most affected by climate change are being well represented at local policy and decision-making level is paramount. And if we do this, then we can think about green innovation in a different way. We need to start thinking about, well, who is included when we're thinking about green innovation? And it's going back to what Kristen was saying. It's like, well, who's involved in those decision-making processes? Who's around the table? And again, looking at climate change and adaptation policies and plans, is thinking about who are those that are most affected, and are those voices being heard around the table? And that then touches on democracy. What is true democracy? And in the UK, do we really have true democracy? Are the people that are being most affected and being impacted, are they actually being heard? And then it's the community. It's looking at who is community and what do we classify as community, and then looking at poverty and seeing, and I think poverty has been highlighted by all the speakers, is looking at how poverty can have a detrimental effect both on health inequalities and also environmental inequalities. Right, next slide, please. Right. So one of the examples that I wanted to use of a good example of what's come out of community working together is community energy. And this is like, for me, it's very much about putting people at the heart of an energy system, right? So they're allowed to then think about what that energy system would mean for them. How do they get involved in terms of planning, in terms of delivering, and in terms of installing? So there is a great project called the Repowering Project in London, which has actually started working on an community energy project. And this has created resilient and it's empowered communities right across London with much more ownership and control of their energy generation and usage. So it's a brilliant project to have a look at, the Repowering Project. And again, up in Scotland, we're actually looking at Local Energy Scotland, which is a government body, to see, well, what could urban local energy look like in terms of renewable and community ownership. So the benefits of community involvement, right? So looking at just the renewable project, so it's about decentralizing our energy systems, so bringing that back to a local level and having local ownership. Local leadership, right? So it does promote local leadership in terms of mentoring, in terms of having a voice, in terms of being able to be involved in decision making and community ownership. Training and employment. So it allows training and employment opportunities for local people. So people that are being affected and people that actually need the support, rather than outsourcing like employment or training. It reduces fuel poverty. So tackling fuel poverty through energy efficiency measures and supporting behavioural change. A lot of emphasis around climate change is around individual change and around behaviour change. And however, when you're in a community that's very marginalised, it feels so alienated to be responsible for something that's way out of your control. And so I think having a local energy system such as this actually can bring that to home and say, right, okay, we have responsibility and we are in control of our own individual changes. Social investment provides opportunity for local and socially responsible investment. Right, okay, so moving on. Right, so other areas, so we looked at energy, right? So energy is, so looking at, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Right, okay, so moving on, so looking at going beyond energy and looking at other built environments. So looking to see who are most affected within like a flood risk management is really important. And again, Kirsten, one of the other speakers, spoke about green spaces, but also looking at green and blue spaces. And again, for me, this goes beyond just poverty, but also looking at health inequalities and the importance of connecting to nature and who has that connection to nature, and who makes the decisions about who is allowed to be connected to nature. And for me, again, it's about who holds the power here. Looking at transport and infrastructure, it's very easy to say that, right, okay, we can all like transfer to now having electrical vehicles. But again, if you can't afford electrical vehicles, it's very difficult to make those individual changes. Looking at new housing, again, it's about accessibility to new housing, but also about planning and looking at new housing and seeing if it's suitable for some of the families that maybe these housings are if these new housings are suitable for different types of families and different family structures and different family sizes as well. And because within BME communities, you have families that live within intergenerational families. So there's more than one family that can live within a household. Right. Looking at heat resilience strategies as well. So again, it's about how buildings are used and by whom they are used, and how people from different parts of the world use buildings in a different way and use heating systems in a different way as well. So it's recognizing that. And for me, all of this is really important because it's not just about doing to somebody, but it's actually learning about existing sustainable behaviors from other parts of the world and how can we bring them in to our built environment here. So what can we do to ensure that nobody's left behind? So again, it's looking at who is community. Typically, when we think about community, we think about a community, a geographical community, a community of location, a locality. And when consultations are done with communities, those are the communities that are brought in to discuss community planning. However, a lot of BME communities are communities of interest, so go beyond the geographical community. So it's very important to reach out and recognize that what is the definition of community and how we can bring in different communities. Decision making, looking at stakeholder groups and working groups, so looking to see how well they are represented and whose voices are represented on decision making and stakeholding. And again, this is important because I think there's a two-way learning here. So it's again learning about existing sustainable behaviours that might be within communities that we don't know about. And if they're not around the table, then how do we know? Engagement strategies. Engagement strategies on climate change. One of the good ones, a good example is the Climate Challenge Fund in Scotland. So the Climate Challenge Fund has gone beyond just looking at just mainstream organisations, but actually has done targeted work with BME communities. So over the last 8 years, we've now got over 150 BME projects working across Scotland on climate change. So again, it's like thinking about, well, how do we include and going out the way to ensure there is inclusion with marginalised community groups. Looking at workforce. So again, looking to see who is represented in the workforce, and if there is a gap, recognise that there is a gap and put in pathways to encourage more people from BME communities to be part of the workforce. And when we talk about communication methods, it's going beyond just translating materials. It's making sure that communication is accessible to all in terms of what does the literature look like? Do we need literature? Can we use other ways to communicate and to get rid of jargon and bring language that is much more accessible to everyday people? Right. And finally, going back to the beginning and saying, why is it now? Why is there a time for change? For me, that we're in this crucial point, that there is this thirst for change right now. There's a drive for change, there's a spark for change. And again, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the stark inequalities in society, as has Black Lives Movement. And therefore, going forward, thinking about the climate crisis, again, it's all these marginalised community groups that are going to be impacted by climate change. So let's start doing with and not doing to, and it's time to unite and take positive action. Thank you.
Thank you, Zarina. That was it was great to finish on such a powerful call to action there. I'm going to invite all the speakers to join me now for a panel discussion. So if you could all turn your video and audio on, that would be great. And yeah, we're going to have a brief panel discussion before we move on to the Q&A. So if you would like to ask any of our speakers a question, please write your question in the Q&A box with your name and organisation, and we'll do our best to get through them all, as I said. So yeah, we've got everybody on screen there, that's great. So just, I guess, to start off where we finished there with Zarina's point about bringing more people into the conversation. And perhaps this is a question for Tom and Ben initially, but as built environment practitioners, as designers and planners and architects, how do you think we can be better at that? And also, how do we have some of those difficult conversations with people about behaviour change, as you mentioned, Ben, also kind of selling the benefits, as you mentioned, Kristen. How do we talk to people about those things in a better, more constructive way?
I think consultation. I mean, I think at PTE we've been a co-design practice architects for 30 years more, doing estate regen, and it's starting early, going to communities and asking them what they want, even before you've started designing anything. Going in what they want, using plain language, communicating in lots of different ways. We've got a consultation team here who are very used to going to all sorts of communities and finding out what they really need. And just, it's all about communication. So selling, you don't need to sell it. It's just saying it in the right, using the right language. So, you know, feel comfort, low energy bills, easy to use. And some of the examples that I showed are very radical, obviously, but the stuff we're doing now might seem technical, but we're trying to make it very simple to use. I think that's the actual absolute key. So making it so any community, any background can use it. So you don't need to have smart controls. You don't need to have complicated systems. In fact, that's the absolute opposite that we should be doing. And that's some of the problems that have happened in recent estate regen, where we've been building huge power stations on each site and having quite complex systems controlling heating and hot water. We absolutely shouldn't be doing that. We should be doing much simpler systems for people to understand and build. That's me.
Okay, thanks. Ben, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I think we have to constantly kind of think about different hooks for different people, because people engage in different ways. And I mean, I suppose a reflection from me is that I spent early part of my career doing lots of sort of quite technical work around energy modeling, more sort of on the energy efficiency design side of things, and then sort of starting to go into cities for conversations around strategies around carbon reduction, climate resilience, urban resilience. What I observed through that period was that so many of the solutions were basically nature-based, and I found it easier to engage with people on those topics than I did if talking about carbon or some of the more technical modeling aspects. So that was why the National Park City started to appeal to me as a different entry point to a climate conversation. And then to kind of extend that on, quite recently, I've been involved in an event down in South London where we basically have like a hip hop day, and basically get a load of people to come out to enjoy hip hop music. But when they're there, have events around urban planting and actually engage them in the environment and nature through their music. So I just think you have to constantly kind of think about different ways to engage different audiences. And it's not always the obvious channels. And then I think I just finished by saying on that consumption point, and by the way, I feel like I should say that, you know, I'm no paragon of virtue on this response. I probably live a very similar life to everyone else. It's very, very difficult. But we've got to like make the conversation less about sacrifice and more about joy. Yeah. Like, yeah, you know, you do have to maybe give some things up. Like you maybe don't have like long haul holidays every year, but actually you can have some amazing holidays in the UK. And so it's got to be about that narrative rather than, you know, oh, you know, how terrible I wasn't able to go on a long haul flight somewhere. And in other domains, it's the same. I mean, food is a classic example. Like people think that not eating red meat is a massive sacrifice, but actually, like look at some of the other options that are starting to come forward now, and actually, you know, really, really enjoyable. So I think that narrative around joy is important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Zarina, does that narrative resonate with you and some of the work that you are doing with communities?
Yes, it does. And I think I agree with Ben. I think you have to look at different ways to communicate with different community groups. But what I would emphasize is don't underestimate, like, oh God, the intelligence of community groups. Because what is a community group? A community group is made of people, like, you know, from different diverse backgrounds, not just in terms of ethnicities, but skill sets. So I think sometimes you have to be careful about oversimplifying something. And I think it's very much about convenience, because we live in a society of convenience. So when we talk about making things simple, it's really about making things convenient for people. And if that change is convenient, then that change will happen. And it's not just about oversimplifying things. And I think you have to be careful with that, because then you can actually come across as being patronizing and doing too by hiding you know, by hiding the language, hiding the jargon, hiding the technology. I think we have to be really inclusive and bring people along with us rather than creating further silos by oversimplifying something.
Thank you. Yeah, and a lot of this talk about behaviour change, I think there's a link in the chat, but we ran an event during our conference week on behaviour change. So I would yeah, suggest that everybody checks that out at some point. But yeah, Zarina's reference to silos leads me on to my next point. So a few of you mentioned the importance of breaking down silos and more cross-sector working, particularly Helen and Kristen, in terms of bringing, you know, healthy urbanism to the forefront of the agenda. So I wondered if, yeah, this is a question perhaps for the two of you first of all, but what are the practical steps that built environment professionals should take to accelerate a shift away from our existing approach, where people and health are quite separate, towards the approach that Helen, you've advocated for?
I think, kind of building on from the conversation so far, to a certain extent, I feel it's not so much, you know, how can we convince certain community groups to have more sustainable behaviors, but how can we fundamentally shift the models of development which say certain community, or which result in certain communities being really adversely disadvantaged. And we haven't got beyond that yet. We haven't fixed that yet. So we still build lots of development around London and elsewhere in the country where the low income affordable housing or the lower income housing is in the worst part of the site. And those communities will be most affected by, for example, overheating and noise, being asked to self-isolate in an overheating, you know, small house. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I think, yes, the behavior change and those aspects are important, but for a start, we just need to make sure that everybody has those basic, affordable, high quality housing that's not going to, you know, then say on top of that, oh, you have poor housing, but we also want you to give up your car, and that person has to drive in order to get to work. So it's sort of getting to some of those root understandings of what people need for a basic quality of life. And I think the conversation about the community engagement, our traditional ways that we've been doing it haven't necessarily got to the full community. And that was what Ben was talking about, looking at those different ways, and Zarina mentioned as well. I think it's about those of us who have been working in this area stepping back and actually funding new organizations, maybe perhaps smaller community-based organizations, to do that work. And rather than sort of directing it and trying to direct the outcomes of it, being much more open to it, perhaps not going the way we thought it might, but that we would learn a lot from that process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Kristen, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think what everybody else is saying makes a lot of sense. I think one thing that keeps coming back to me is that I think as long as we're seeing this as an environmental issue, that kind of keeps it in this little place that's, you know, where people say, oh, that's kind of over there, and we're just going to do our thing over here, and that, you know, environment is over there. But it really isn't. I mean, it's a health issue, and it's, you know, it's a built environment issue, and so forth and so on. And I think, you know, that helps us maybe to think about that a bit more widely. And I think sometimes I get a bit, I don't know, I feel a bit desperate now and again when I think about how big this issue is in terms of, you know, I mean, for adaptation, because adaptation to climate change, which can also be adaptation to lots of other things, and, you know, an opportunity to think about, you know, a better world in the future. I think it just requires so much, you know, requires so much, you know, interaction with different kinds of issues, and the amount of resource that we put into it in this country, as opposed to sort of the way where, you know, for example, the government puts loads of money into adaptation overseas, but basically nothing here in the UK. And it's something that we need to think about. But just on the specific question too about, you know, how we can overcome some of these issues in the built environment. I know that some colleagues at UCL have recently just put together some, I think it's kind of guidelines, some stuff about decision making in the built environment. So thinking about what actually, you know, what sorts of things are happening in different aspects of, built environment that you can start to, think about where to incorporate social justice and inequality, and thinking about these questions that we're raising today. So I'll find a link to that, but I thought it was quite useful, because we talk about this stuff quite a lot in terms of the issues, but in terms of making it really practical and how does it actually affect the things that we do. I think this type of guidance, this kind of help to think about it in a practical way, is useful.
Yeah, and that kind of reference to funding that you made, I think there is a fear perhaps that as a result of COVID, particularly for local authorities, that funding is going to be even more of an issue for their environmental and sustainability priorities. So I guess, do you have any advice for local authorities regarding adapting to climate change in the near future in light of perhaps tightened budgets? So are there any quick wins? I mean, this could be a question for all of you, perhaps. But what should be the priorities, do you think, in the next couple of months, year or so?
I think for me, that's just, and other people might want to chip in. It's just such a tough one because we know that local authorities are just desperate, to hang on and do the things that they need to do on a statutory basis. And I think the best thing would probably be to somehow be able to have the capacity to look around at the things that they're already doing and try to think about how you climate proof those things, and looking at your longer term decisions. So it's not necessarily everything that needs to be kind of made more climate resilient. It's things like, are you building things? Are you making long-term decisions with massive investments? And some of those things mean that you don't actually require more money, but it does require the headspace to actually work that out, to understand where the potential opportunities are. And I think so many local authority officers just don't have that headspace. And the other thing, again, I'll just go back to that point about it's not an environmental issue. And in a local authority, because it seems like it's an environmental issue or a climate issue, it gets put with the person who is, also trying to deal with waste and other environmental issues and recycling and, energy efficiency and so forth. And it's a different set of skills. It's a different, it's different priorities and different sets of skills that you need to do that. And we're asking an awful lot of people who already have jobs when we tell them to think about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Would anyone else like to chip in there? Serena, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's just to add on to what Kristen was saying about waste. I think when we look at waste and look at recycling, and I think because a lot of local authorities take the lead in these issues, but it's going back to what Ben was saying, it's also about tackling consumption. And I think the messages when we talk about waste, we should tie in messages around consumption and our global responsibility around consumption. And I think we miss a trick when we don't do that. And for me, that doesn't cost a lot. There's not a cost element involved in that. And I think that's something that local authorities could actually start leading on.
I'd add that I think it's just, I think this idea of carbon literacy and people understanding more and more has completely changed in the last couple of years, hasn't it? I mean, everybody's talking about it. I think 10 years ago, if I was to go to a site and start talking about zero carbon or passive house or reusing waste materials, I'd get a blank look, and the developer would be very kind of sort of probably put off. A lot of people would be put off, but now it's just completely changed with Extinction Rebellion, with all sorts of drivers across government, that they're just looking at it going, right, this really is a social justice issue. It's not it's linked to the environment, and it's just gone completely up the food chain in terms of demand. And I think government is starting to realize now it is so central to our national policy, but I think they haven't got the scale right. They don't understand how much needs to change. That's my thing. And I think the key driver will be funding for training and getting appropriate skill sets through schools, carbon literacy, because that creates a demand for better quality housing, better quality communities, and better policy to deliver that. So funding at local level, this green recovery package that people have been talking about, it's like, well, that needs to be That needs to be not delivered in a very centralized way. It needs to be community led. It's given to every community in London and say, right, this is a million quid, go and spend it, go and do low carbon projects, zero carbon projects that are going to have multi benefits that each one of these speakers have talked about today. Health and well-being, jobs. That's going to be absolutely key. And then the only way that we will reach our targets is if we link it to this COVID crisis, because as a nation, we don't really react to things well unless there's a crisis or it's linked to things. And at the moment, it's nearly there, but people aren't connecting the dots. It's just seen as some environmental thing that I'm generalizing, but most people can't really see that it's actually going to happen. Well, it's happening now, and it's linked to your life and your way of being, and obviously
Okay.
the environment.
And Ben, yeah, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Tom was saying. I think he's made just a really, really good point. I don't think it's only about funding. I think it's also about how the funding is distributed. And I think over the last few months, what I've seen is, local authorities who I know have got a long list of things they want to do, but haven't got the funding to do it, seeing the opportunities to get funding and then not actually being able to mobilize to be able to apply for that funding. And I think that sort of perpetuates some of the issues that Zarina was talking about, in terms of it kind of ends up with the funding going to the people who are resourced to be able to get it, or who know how to get it, or know how to write bids, rather than those who necessarily need it. And that's really sad when you see that happening.
So I'm going to move on to some of the questions we have in our Q&A box now, because there's a lot of interesting questions coming through. So I've just asked you about kind of short-term practical things. So now this is a kind of looking at it on a much broader view. This is a question from Dan relating to Helen's point on the need to fundamentally shift the model of development. How does the panel think we might do this? Does anyone want to take that on first of all? Maybe Helen, because it was a reference to your framework.
Well, I think I was thinking about this. I mean, it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I've recently done some interviews internationally in 6 different geographical areas about healthy urban development, and trying to find out what were the different either regulatory mechanisms or funding mechanisms that helped to make this happen. And I think there's a lot of different ways that it can work. And in some examples, I saw the investors for large scale development or landowners taking a much stronger role in saying, we want this new development to be good for the environment, good for health. And that had a huge impact on the project. And so I think where, for example, the Wellcome Trust, a huge healthcare charity, not healthcare, health research charity, has just increased its shares in Urban and Civic, a regeneration company. And I think they should be demanding that the regeneration that Urban and Civic produces is good for health. And I'm not sure whether they have considered that at all, or to what extent they are considering it. But I've been doing a lot of work with Guy's and St. Thomas's charity in South London, and we've been working on the Thrive framework was funded by them, and they are looking at how that can be integrated into their developments that they're involved in, because they are a landowner, not only in London, but in other areas in the Southeast. And I think, those types of organizations that have some leverage in new development can make a big impact. But there's also, I think, a need to change the whole model of development in this country. We need to improve the building regulations and the planning policy to make sure that new developments are healthy and safe. And unfortunately, that is not the case right now. And I think that's clear in the papers. We see lots of scandals have emerged in relation to that, which I think are just really shocking. And we need to up our game in that area.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to attempt an answer to that, Ben?
Yeah, I'll say something on that. I mean, I think, so we're doing a piece of work at the moment looking at guidance around net zero districts. I'd be really interested to hear Tom's perspective on this, because first of all, it's important that I say that I completely advocate for doing as much as you possibly can on any site and working the hierarchy in the right sort of direction. But I do also think that there are some things which are sort of beyond the remit of developers to push forward. And 10 or so years ago, there was a thing in the UK, probably people know about, called allowable solutions, where a developer would pay into a fund, and then the local authority would use that to drive its own action around climate change. Now, those funds still exist in some places, but it's a bit patchy about how they're being used. And when you look internationally about net zero districts, I think something similar has to kind of come into that space. So for me, I think we need to be thinking, when we think about development, certainly at scale, large master plans, big new development in cities, it hasn't got to be just within the red line of that development. I think Helen's framework talks to this point. You know, there is an opportunity, you have a leverage opportunity there to basically extract some money, which can then be used to actually more effectively, more efficiently elsewhere in the city to drive carbon reductions. I mean, classic case where you put a really new development next to an existing leaky development, you know, the obvious value for money thing there is, you know, use some of that money to kind of retrofit those existing homes. So sorry to be a bit long-winded in this response, but I think there has to be something around that kind of community fund model, allowing developers to pay into that in a way which is then spent on broader measures to reduce carbon emissions.
Yeah, Ben, sorry, jumping in. That's really interesting. I think you just have to be really careful about these pots of money. It's just not really working at the moment. The Section 106 money seems to be going off into pot. You've got SIL doing another pot. So if you are going to start talking about incentivizing this sort of development, we need some really clear guidance, guys. We can't just have pots of money going off and one council doing schools, you know, LEDs in schools, and another council doing, you know, double glazing on an estate. It needs to be really clear, because if you just put double glazing in an estate, it's not really providing much benefit to those residents. In fact, it's actually making it worse, disruption and possible condensation. So it needs to be really cleverly thought about on a global scale, but obviously for London especially. And I think offsetting, yes, but I still maintain you have to, as much as you can on that site, you're not getting any additionality. And to get developers to do that, really, this is what we're talking about. A new model for development would be going back to, I mean, socialism, talking about co-housing, community-led housing. Some of the stuff that we're doing at PT with working with co-housing groups is a socialist development model based on shares, based on mutual cooperative society. So you each have a vote, you decide how it goes. So it's about empowering those sorts of groups to come through, because if you do empower groups like that, it's amazing. Our case study at Marmalade Lane in Cambridge and various other co-housing groups in London show that they want the best for their community. They want passive house, they want zero carbon, they want healthy homes, and they become the client, and they then are the landowner, you know, so they need to work with the council to get the land, and they drive change because they're given the power. So I think that would be my response to a new model of development, would be, let's have community-led development. And just to finish off on this point, the community-led housing hub in London, I think that's right, GLA funded money, is a great case study on how we can do the same money, that basically you get a pot of money from Sadiq Khan. You have enablers, project enablers, who are trained professionals in co-housing, community-led housing, various other types of cooperative housing. You go into communities and set up these groups across different backgrounds, completely different. They're all over London. You can go onto their website, and they're funding very cleverly not only the professional advice, but also the capital works as well when you go through, and there's various funding mechanisms for how you do that. But that is deliberately aimed at increasing co-housing. If we could set it up with, and community-led housing, if we set it up with, and also you've got to do this climate justice and provide training and enablers, and then the money, then you'd sort it within 5 years, 10 years. You'd have, and obviously you need the right amounts of money.
Zarina, I was going to come to you. Do you have any thoughts in response to that?
Yeah, I do. It's actually going back to what Helen said, and I think that we've got to start thinking beyond the structures that we have already, right? So it's like saying, right, okay, this is the way we think about housing. So how do we bring communities to think about housing in the same framework that we think about housing already? And it's not what I don't believe this is what Helen's talking about. Thinking this about actually start to think totally outside of the box. And we've got to think about, well, what does really sustainable housing look like? for communities. And for me, I think it's going back to what Ben said earlier on about connecting to nature. And at the moment, during the pandemic, it's really highlighted that those that have little access to green spaces have been impacted by the pandemic and been much more vulnerable. And then also health inequalities, those that don't have access to green spaces, their health is much poorer. And again, when we see that within BME communities, because they live in a very built-up environment in urban areas. And for me, I think we've got to start looking at how is our built environment much more connected to nature, connected to the environment? How do we bring that in to the built environment? And I think then we're tackling both environmental inequalities and also health inequalities, and also looking at poverty inequalities. And I think we've got to start really rethinking the way our existing built environment is.
Okay, so they were all some really great answers. I'm going to move on to another question from Sophia. So this is, I guess, perhaps a question for all of you. What do you think the role of planning is in providing a real push for low or net zero carbon buildings to address the climate emergency? And what single measure could make a real difference if it were introduced today? So any thoughts on planning from any of you? And I guess maybe net zero carbon buildings might be a question for Tom, first of all.
What can planners do? I think they can be, I think planners can just be really set. You can provide a lot of pushback, basically. Planners have a lot of power that sometimes they don't necessarily use or understand. So I think a case in point might be overheating. You take an overheating assessment that we do regularly. A developer might get someone to do the overheating assessment. It's a lot of science. It's very difficult to understand. Even for a planner, they've got 40 reports to look at a major application across all sorts of types of biodiversity, water. You look at the overheating, you don't really understand it. You might get it peer reviewed if it's a major application. So I think it does boil down to this idea of training and providing the right toolkit for planners. So a good example in response to the overheating question would be what we've done at the Good Homes Alliance, which is provide an overheating toolkit for planners. So it's a one-page checklist. Give it to you. It's being used across London and other planning constituencies, mainly in London, because overheating is a big problem in London apartments. And just break it down. It's got a traffic light system. Do you have dual aspect? Do you have good window sizes? And it's got the technical side, and this is the report you need, and this is the specification. If you don't get that, push back on the developer. It's about this challenge. It's one example, but net zero similar.
Should I go, Sophie?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I just really quickly, I think planning is a massive area, right? So, and there's all sorts of different types of planning. So you could be a strategic planner where you're thinking about the vision of your borough in 30 years' time and thinking about how land use evolves. You could be setting policy in your development plans, assessing planning applications, providing development control, or just writing like supplementary planning guidance. I think there are lots of different levers and different sort of intervention points that planners have to kind of make a difference on this angle, and they should be trying to do work in all. But I just sort of say one other thing on this, which is, so I think probably 15 years ago now, I did a project with the GLA called Capacity Building for London Planners. And this is not to say in any way that planners are hugely interested. The ones I've met, certainly the ones who work in area, are really interested in this agenda, but they're not trained in kind of energy and carbon. So to expect that suddenly a load of planners are going to understand the detail of all of these carbon metrics is quite a big ask if you don't provide them with proper training and support to do that. So I would just say that whenever we say, oh, planners can do that, then yeah, there are big opportunities there, but there is also a need for, I think, capacity building and training. We don't necessarily have all the skills that we need.
Okay, I'm going to come to Kristen and Helen as well. I'm just going to throw another question in there because it links to this. So a couple of people have asked in the Q&A, there's a huge push for reskilling people as part of the green recovery and both Tom and Ben have just mentioned that need for capacity building. So as well as if you had an answer to the previous question, but also what skills do you think we're missing and what are we in need of?
Yeah, so thanks. I think just going back to the planning question, I think that's a huge thing there. I mean, the planning policy is often there in London. I mean, we've got some really good policy in terms of preventing overheating and stuff like that, but I think it's just the capacity of planners to actually be able to evaluate planning applications properly that include, those types of measures. And I mean, just going back to Ben's point, absolutely, there's a need for training and understanding. But I've been working on this stuff for about 15 years now, and I've seen so many different training programs for planners and different bits of guidance for planners and different sample policies for planners. And yeah, we still haven't cracked it. And I think, even when the planning policy is there, we know it's not necessarily making things happen on the ground. And I would have definitely also suggested the Good Homes Alliance checklist if Tom hadn't mentioned it. Yeah, and sorry, I can't remember what the other question was.
Well, so the talk about reskilling as part of the green recovery. So I guess you talked a bit more there about, I guess, capacity building and resources, but in addition to that, what skills do you think we need?
Yeah, I mean, we've been having conversations recently in the partnership, just thinking about the skills. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how, even when you decide to do things, the tradespeople don't necessarily have the skills to carry out the building works required to do things properly. And so it's just trying to understand how we can fix that here in London. I mean, we hear about it, but we don't have an awful lot of it. And I don't know if other people know more, but we have a lot of anecdotal evidence about this, but we don't have a lot of quantified evidence about what skills are actually needed and what types of training are actually needed on specific issues. So
okay. More evidence, more data. Tom, I can see you've got your hand up. I just wanted to quickly ask Zarina how that skills issue ties in with some of the points you were making about empowering communities and training opportunities. Is there a trick that we're missing there in terms of who we are giving these skills to?
Yeah, I think looking at BME communities, the training that's provided is always at low level skills, and I think there's not enough pathways, career guidance or internships or apprenticeships into different fields within the built environment. And I think from being within the built environment, people within the built environment should recognise where those gaps are for engagement with different diverse communities, and then start creating different pathways to allow more people within that. And I think the skills development is also about bringing in different voices, different heads, different perspectives as well. And I think that's got to be recognised and provide the tools to enable that to happen.
Okay, yeah, so skills development is as much a diversity issue as anything else. And Tom, sorry, going back to you, you did have your hand up there.
Yeah, I completely agree with that last point. The research that we've done and others have done before has always pointed towards lack of skills on building sites. And that's the stuff with Zero Carbon Hub, the Builder's book I wrote a few years back. The research basically was showing that this lack of skills on site was creating a performance gap, therefore poor quality buildings, shall we say. But the idea of performance gap. What we're now finding, the Building for 2050 project, is it's actually not really that. When you go on site, there's actually plenty of skills. They know what they're doing. You speak to trades on these sites. It's we know what that is. It's a piece of kit, whatever it is, MBHR, HIU. We've been shown how to install it. Most of the time, it's not that problem. There's lots of training programs on a site level for various trades. What we're now finding is the kind of the next one down or up in terms of the design and the coordination between these kind of complex technologies is causing this performance gap. It's this idea of poor quality construction leading to increased carbon emissions. And there's been various papers that have assessing actually it's the the kind of professions that need training and people coming up.
Oh, I think, Tom, you've broken up there. It might be worth turning off your video for a moment. We'll come back to you in a second, Tom. I've got a final question, I think, for Ben and Helen might be the best people to respond to this. So this is a question from Catherine Max. She's been doing some thinking about landscape-led planning and whether starting from the whole landscape end rather than buildings and growth could be healthier, more inclusive and sustainable. Any thoughts on how this might work? Yeah, Ben, you have a go first, Helen.
No, sorry, Helen, if you want to go first, that's fine. Hi, Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of itching to say in relation to planning that as a profession in the UK, it has really been sort of whittled down into very narrow scope. And that's certainly not why I trained as a planner 20 years ago. And I don't think many people going into planning just see their job as rubber stamping development. It is what Catherine described. It is supposed to be a much more strategic, visionary job where you're looking at where you want to be as a city over time, or maybe in a rural area, depending on where you're working, and how you're going to get there, and what are the trends and what are the challenges and what sorts of policies do you need to put in place. And it should be the case that planners have a very a strong role at the central decision-making table within local government, and that both councillors and officers are working together at integrating planning policies across all of the other sectors of local government. And I think, so yes, it is, sort of landscape and much more strategic level thinking that's required, definitely not focused just on buildings and growth. And that is as a result of sort of national government decision-making about taking away regulation rather than what planners are trained to do. We are certainly trained in more of that visionary thinking. And I think when it comes to skills gaps, I don't think that planners can take on all of those technical environmental design and engineering skills. I know for me that hasn't been possible, even though I've delved into that. We want to have that more strategic, larger scale role. And that I think other mechanisms like regulation should come in place to help us meet those requirements for zero carbon.
Thank you. And Ben, perhaps your final thoughts, because we are drawing towards the end of our allotted time this morning.
Yeah, no, I can be quick. I agree with Helen's response, and I think it's an interesting question. I think we can fall into a trap, and I went to an interesting session at GLA where we're talking about the urban greening factor. We can fall into a trap about thinking about those things on a site level. I mean, that whole process is supposed to be moderated by what's needed in that area. And so the scales kind of should work out like that. And I think we should be thinking in that way, from site to the area to the landscape to the city. And then actually, I was involved in a really interesting piece of work to do a vision for the protected landscapes around London a few years ago. And when you start to look at all the 12 landscapes that sit around London, it's really quite an exciting, probably the greenest city region in the world. So I think we should be thinking in those terms and about connectivity. And, I think, to be fair, sorry, I said I was going to be quick, but, the GLA has done some great work in this area already with the All London Green Grid and so on, to kind of show how nature needs to kind of come into the city, into the urban environment. So yeah, I think Catherine's onto something there. Should keep going.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to draw the Q&A to a close there. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions. There's been a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A box, and also comments made in the chat. So I hope it's been stimulating for everybody. So thank you to all of our brilliant panelists for your interesting presentations and discussion. And thank you also to our audience today for all your insightful comments and questions and insights. So if you would like to read or watch any of our work on achieving net zero so far, so our conference content, our case studies, our event write-ups, you can go to the Achieving Net Zero pages on our website, and also Future of London's YouTube channel. There are links there on the screen, but we will be sending these slides around as well, so you'll be able to access that afterwards. There will be a write-up and video of this event too, so please share them with your networks when we send you the links. And in early 2021, we'll be publishing our Achieving Net Zero report. So sign up to the Future of London mailing list to get all the updates about this programme and other Future of London events. And this event has been part of London Climate Action Week, so don't forget to look at their website as well. There are loads of really interesting things happening this week, including events on building a net zero London, the green recovery, and how we can mobilise the whole of society to tackle climate change. So lots of the topics that we've been talking about today. And last of all, when you leave this webinar, you'll see a link to a feedback survey, and we're really keen to hear from you. So please leave us some feedback. It helps shape and plan our future events, our future programmes. So thank you again to everybody for joining us today. And it's goodbye from me, goodbye from Future of London, and we hope to see you at an event soon. Thank you very much.